Well, hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My name is Dan Glickman, former Secretary of Agriculture, and along with my co-moderator and former Secretary, Ann Veneman, who we are here today to welcome you to this Bipartisan Policy Center Food Summit. We want to thank you all for being here. We want to thank our guests, and especially Secretary Perdue, who Ann will introduce in a minute. This has become one of the most talked about issues of the whole COVID-19 issue, which has to relate to the food supply, from the production to the processing to the distributing to the consumption, and how it affects farmers, how it affects processors, and how it affects the average persons, and particularly the hungry. So we're delighted to be here. We can't delve into every issue in great depth because of the time, but it's a way to start the discussion, and we think you're going to have an interesting time listening to this very, very important issue about feeding this country. So I would like to, again, welcome everybody and thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for their hosting of this event, and turn it over to my colleague, Secretary Ann Veneman.
Well, thank you as always, Dan Glickman. It's always a pleasure to be with you. So it is my honor today to introduce our first speaker, the 31st Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue. Now, as secretaries, all three of us have faced trying times during our tenure. In my case, it included 9/11 and BSE, but today, as Dan Glickman said, we are facing unprecedented challenges to the food system as the COVID-19 pandemic has spread around the globe. So we want to say thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today to discuss these challenges and how the USDA is responding during this extraordinary time. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you to my former colleague, Secretary Veneman and Secretary Glickman. It's good to be with you and good to be with our host, the BPC, of which I had the honor of serving on the Governor's Council. So I know of the work and I appreciate the convening of this topic. It's almost like every crisis has its own language, if you think about it. And who in America had thought about food supply chain prior to now? And I guess more Americans are aware. We've often talked about the fact that in modern day America, certainly in urban America, most people think about food really coming from the grocery store. But with the food supply chain, we've had to broaden that expectation and understanding exactly what has happened here in America. I believe I'm even guilty of not understanding the very dual track, parallel production and processing and logistics and delivery systems that we had in the United States of America. We have, when we think about the context of what we faced, with over 50% of the food we consume being consumed out of the home, we had a production scheme, a very efficient, synchronized, integrated, sophisticated delivery system, both for the production and the processing and the logistics and the delivery to the different sectors. One being the institutional setting, being restaurants and other congregate feeding areas, and one being to the consumer through retail, mostly in grocery chains in that way. So when you think about that, the processors in the middle were processing for different consumers, for different packaging, different sizes, and other things. And what caused all the realignment, we had one of those 50% chains stopped very suddenly. I liken it to the fact of being on a 4-lane interstate and really a major crash occurs ahead, and two of those lanes are totally blocked, and we all know what happens then. Things back up very, very quickly. And if we're in that kind of thing, my spouse would say, well, why didn't you anticipate this and take a detour around this crash? But then maybe that's what the question everyone's asking. Why didn't we anticipate all this, and what could we have done? The fact is, no one could have anticipated the issues that we have in the food supply chain and the degree to which we were segregated in our production and processing. But obviously, as you former secretaries know, it's USDA's role to be flexible and to move very quickly in these in realigning these dislocations and misalignments that we had in the supply chain in order to do that. I'm very proud of the team here. You've probably heard me say before, our motto is to do right and feed everyone. And this presented a huge challenge, obviously, in where Katie is, and certainly our hunger area, but also just in our regular supply chains of grocery stores. You remember, it's like a national hurricane warning initially, and people fled to the grocery stores, and some shelves became bare, and that created even more panic there, Leslie, as we saw the people wondering if we were going to have enough food. That was the first question. Secondly, right away, we had schools closing. Where do most of these kids get their nutrition from? Both free and reduced lunch and breakfast for our schools. So we had to make very immediate flexibilities there. And as you secretaries formerly know, we all have to do things in the federal government by rule and regulation. And we've got certain criteria that try to preserve the integrity of the processes, because this is public money, and we have to preserve an integrity of that and maintain an integrity of the way things are handled and delivered. But that also creates an inflexibility in times like this. So we had to do many, many waivers initially in order to get these kids fed. And it was amazing how communities reached up and reached out to get the kids fed. There were a lot of programs that way. And one interesting was this public-private partnership with Baylor University, their Hunger and Poverty Center, and McLean Global, a logistics company, PepsiCo, a multinational, joined together to deliver initially over 1 million meals a week to school kids in rural areas that couldn't get into the congregate pickup sites. That eventually went to 5 million meals a week with doing those kind of things. So those are the good news stories. We had many other waivers. We had certainly for our pandemic EBT, where you loaded the amount of the school lunches and breakfasts on the EBT card for our reduced lunch, free and reduced lunch kids there, so they could get food that way, and many other waivers in that way. The school nutrition professionals, local school systems, and many in the private sector did wonderful things. Then we had our SNAP population, obviously our supplemental nutrition population, where the crisis occurred, and we had to continue to have flexibilities there over online shopping to enable that in many states, that all those that applied. We had to do the TFAP program that helped to move the food into our food banks and other things that are normally used for local disaster. We had the household distribution program that usually is used for localized disaster when there's not access, for grocery stores are closed. We had to be able to use that in states as well. So it required a lot of creativity and a lot of ingenuity. And the one program that we are really rolling out now, that we announced on Friday with that we're really proud of, and that's the Farmers to Families food box program. It's really disheartening to all of us in agriculture, Zippy, when a farmer or a producer puts their blood, sweat, and tears into growing animals or vegetables or produce or milk, and having to destroy that milk or dairy produce or meat because it's the misalignment of can't getting that protein where it needs to be. And this food box program, it's $3 billion of the $19 billion program that the president announced. $3 billion will be that, and it's up and running with the contracts in place over local regional distributors who've been used to using and serving the distribution market in retail or in restaurants and congregate serving. Then it's a great nationwide program. We look very much forward to seeing that run out. The other thing we've tried to do with our Feeding America group is to work very early on the TFAP program and helping to get those, and other people have worked locally in helping to get food to those citizens that showed up at the food bank having lost their jobs in other ways. So it's been quite a scramble. Obviously, farmers and producers are in a real bind. We've also had the situation with our food processing, and part of that chain is not only what Zippy does in his constituents in producing that food, we have to process it and pack it for consumer consumption. And we've had somewhat of a crisis in that area with many of our workers coming down with positive COVID-19s, and we've had to work around it, having meat processing closed, and the president's executive order helped us get some uniformity back there. We've turned the corner, but we're still underneath what our capacity is. But I think we can still say that we're going to have meat protein for the future. It looks like we're in, all those plants except a couple are open now, even with reduced forces, but they're working very well. So USDA has had its hands full. Our food, nutrition, consumer services crowd has just been amazing in a 24-hour session. Our AMS with its purchasing program and delivery and logistics program to our food bank network has been amazing. And I'm really proud of the crowd. Having done all of that really in remote situations, we can't come together in a conference huddle, but we've been Skyping almost all the time. Actually, I feel more tired when I go home now, having been on Skype all day long, than I do having meetings all day long. But anyway, the team has just been amazing. I'm really proud of the group, and I'm proud of all these workers, both from the farmers that have stayed in the field, to the processors and packers that have stayed there, to the logistics and the truckers that deliver this food, the grocery store stockers and the grocery store checkout that made sure we got a consistent supply. So the most efficient, sophisticated, synchronized food supply chain in the world has been nimble enough to continue to supply our people with the confidence that we can have food. And that, I think, helps to fulfill that motto of doing right and feeding everyone. Did we do everything perfectly? No, I'm not saying that, but we worked really as hard as we could to make sure the people who needed our food mostly were able to get that. So thank you all. I look forward to hearing the rest of you all.
Okay, I think we're going to now introduce our panel, and there have been a couple of changes in the panel, so I want to make sure that people know. We're going to go through 4 people. First will be Zippy Duvall, who's president of the American Farm Bureau. Delighted to have you, Zippy, here. Second will be Juliana Potts, who's president and CEO of the North American Meat Institute. 3, and she's going to be talking a lot about the processing industry and what's happening in terms of preparing this meat for the consumer. The third will be Leslie Saracen, president and CEO of FMI, used to be known as the Food Marketing Institute. We talk about the distribution of food and the retailing side of the picture. And finally will be Katie Fitzgerald, EVP and COO of Feeding America, who will talk about the impact on the nation's food banks, the nation's poor, maybe talk a little bit about the SNAP program, as well as talking about this enormous increase in the numbers of people because of rapidly increasing unemployment who are in these food bank lines that we've not seen probably since the Great Depression. So given that, I'm going to start first with Zippy, then I'll go to Juliana, then Leslie, and then Katie. And then if you would each maybe talk for about 5 minutes of the challenges that you see in the food supply chain and how it affects your business, your members, and what you do. So let's start with Zippy. You
need to unmute.
Unmute. Everybody needs to unmute. Yeah, when they talk.
Thank you so much. What I was saying was I'm just honored and feel very privileged to be among the speakers today. And thank you for having me on to be the voice of the American farmer and rancher. Today my role is to talk about the production and how the pandemic has affected us. And of course, in 5 minutes, there's no way you can talk about American agriculture, all segments of it, but I'll touch on the major hotspots that we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks. Of course, I described the situation that we're in agriculture like the perfect storm that we have experienced. And it didn't just start with this, with the pandemic. Agriculture during the last 7 or 8 years has been in a declining economy. When everybody else's economy has been booming, ours has been kind of dwindling behind. We're about 50% of our income, and we're also having a difficult time with this last ingredient of the perfect storm after all the natural disasters and everything that we've experienced in the trade war. We're very appreciative of the assistance that the Secretary and the President has brought to agriculture in the last 2 years, and we look forward to continuing to work with them. But that perfect storm has caused an increase in the last 12 months, ending in March 2020, increase in bankruptcies, 627 bankruptcies, up 27% of the year before that. And we're very, very concerned about the ability of our farmers to be able to repay debt and the flexibility that the financial markets are going to allow for our farmers going into the future to be able to get operating loans to plant future crops. And of course, a main player in how we survive the financial position that we're in is going to depend on the program that the Secretary is going to deliver to us from the CARES Act. We're very appreciative of the President signing it. We thank Congress for putting it out there. And I know that the Secretary and all his employees have worked very hard and very diligent to be able to roll it out, and we'll look forward to that happening at the end of the month. And what comes in that package is going to really determine how soon our farmers can, how they can hold on to their futures. Of course, one of the things that we've all been talking about the last 2 or 3 weeks that has severely crippled agriculture is the processing plants and the problems that we've had in getting our animal and protein harvested. It has touched not just protein, but it's also touched dairy, and it's touched poultry and pork. It's also touched vegetables and fruits and vegetables. So it's almost the processing part of it has really just hit us in the face. I think the American people and even farmers didn't really talk about the processing part. And now we see what an important link that is in our food chain. Of course, the number one concern of all of us is that the employees on our farms, the employees in the processing plants, the employees at the grocery stores, everybody along the chain be safe, and the things that we can do to protect them and their families after they get through working and going back home. What is the new normal? Who knows? This food chain that we work in and operate in today didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen in a vacuum. So how this virus is going to end up shaping agriculture and this food chain in the future, we really don't know that. What we do know is, as farmers, that we have to get the processing part of this right. We have to find the solutions to the problems. We have to get back to 100% capacity, because that we all know as agricultural people, that pipeline leading especially animals to harvest, that pipeline is full. And when we have a glitch in the processing, that pipeline backs up, and it costs millions and millions and millions of dollars to our farmers. I want to say thank you to the Secretary for the Farm to Families food box program. We're real excited about that. Katie, we reached out to Feeding America and asked y'all to sign on to a letter with us to have the conversation with USDA about creating a program such as that. We think they've done a tremendous job with that, and we were just delighted to see them deliver that out. I understand it's very popular with more than 600 people putting in plans to be able to utilize that, 600 companies. It's going to put people back to work. It's going to get food from farms that would be destroyed back out to people that deserve it and need it. So we're just excited about being a partner in that, and we congratulate Secretary Perdue and his people on developing that program. One of the areas I've been talking about that I don't think we've talked about enough that I'm really concerned about that hits our heartland. And that is what's going to happen to corn in this pandemic and people staying at home, less driving. And then of course, we've had kind of a war among oil people. The ethanol plants have continued to close down. And ethanol is a big part of rural America. It's a big part. It's what rural America did to help our country become energy sufficient, being able to not depend on the rest of the world for our energy. And corn in rural America played a major role in getting us to that position. And now those plants are shut down. That's going to affect corn prices. It's going to affect the DDGs that come out of those plants that's refed, that is a byproduct that's fed to animals. And with the processing plants having problems, we've got less animals going to be fed in the near future. That's going to be less corn consumed. So corn is really facing a difficult time, and I'm really concerned about what's going on with that. But that infrastructure around ethanol is just so important to rural America. And we need to kind of focus on what's going to happen and how we make that industry survive, because it's an important link in what our farmers depend on. Of course, we also are real concerned about how the new phase 1 trade treaty comes out. We know that there's some difficult conversations going on about many different areas of our society, but those difficult conversations could make the reality and the goals in phase 1 trade agreement with China difficult. And all of our agricultural commodities need very badly for the phase 1 $40 billion worth of purchases that China promised to exercise this year. We need that to happen. It would help strengthen our commodity prices and help our farmers get through that. So we've had tremendous challenges. I could go on and talk, but I can't stop talking about agriculture to talk about my concern about bringing young people into agriculture. And how could you ask a young man or a young woman to consider agriculture in the future when we're going through such difficult times? We have to make agriculture bright for the future. We have to make it, get it back on the profitable grounds so that we can draw people back to the industry and prepare this industry for the future. We can only do it by bringing the bright young people back. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Zippy, very much. You ended right when I was going to tell you to end, so that worked out really well. So next, and we'll get to questions afterwards. I want people to know that. But next we have Juliana Potts, who is president and CEO of the North American Meat Institute, has a huge background in agriculture, to talk about the processing side of the picture, which is kind of the area that has received the most attention lately, and the one that's been a gridlock a bit for the supply chain. So Juliana,
sure.
Yours.
Thank you so much, Secretary Glickman. I am also very honored to be with you all today. My role, I guess, is to kind of represent a lot of the processing, but of course, meat and poultry processing has been very high profile in the recent weeks. Secretary Perdue also touched on some of the things that the viewers here have been reading about. So it's my pleasure to kind of go back a little bit and talk about some of these challenges, what we've done to address them, and how we are looking at moving forward as we begin to see, as Secretary Perdue said, sort of turning the corner on these packing plants and other processors getting back up to full capacity. Way back in February, when it became clear that we were going to be facing this pandemic, members of our organization across the entire spectrum, so from the very large companies to the very small, began meeting weekly by telephone through the trade association to share best practices. They were actually very proactive in the kinds of things they put in place at their processing plants to deal with what was going to come our way, because it was rolling across the whole country. So things like additional sanitation, extra communications about how to work within the plant and stay within PPE if it was available. Things that were communicated about being with people who were sick outside the plant, so screening questions, and at every opportunity, sending people away who were exhibiting any symptoms or answered, yes to any of the screening questions. This all started, toward the beginning of this whole thing, and yet we knew it was coming, and we have seen just a tremendous amount of COVID that has happened within the workforce of our processing plants. We were in more or less constant communication with USDA, with OSHA, and with the CDC on getting some additional guidance on how to deal with the situation as local health authorities and state health authorities took different approaches as things began to come up in their communities. In addition to some of the challenges with COVID in the workforce and the plants, there was a lot of absenteeism due to fear. And processing, the harvesting of animals and the processing of meat is still a very labor-intensive activity. It still requires physical labor. And the labor situation, even before COVID, for our plants was very tight. Any challenge you ask about, pretty much in the first top one or two would be the workforce and the ability to keep people. So while the top priority for our companies was always the safety and has been the safety of the workforce and continues to be, the slowing of the lines, the slowing of processing, and the closure, as we have seen rolling across the country in different geographic areas, was something that began to produce the kind of backup, as Zippy noted, in agriculture of our livestock. And that had become a critical problem a couple weeks ago, and something that the White House, USDA, and other agencies stepped up to address in quite an extraordinary way. So we believe that we are maybe the first industry outside of defense that has been the subject of a Defense Production Act executive order anyway. And that was a sign that we really needed to have that kind of federal involvement in getting our plants back up to speed, because it had become so critical. So we're looking at all of the challenges that we have going forward to get our food service back up and running. But our first priority is the safety of our workers, and then to get our plants back up to speed 100% so we can process the backlog of animals that we have out there in the heartland.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for being succinct in your discussion. I might mention we've had some changes and we're glad that you're here, but we've had a couple of folks who couldn't be here that you might have seen when you entered this Zoom situation. I want to make sure that folks know that they can use the Q&A tab for questions if they have them, so that, because there will be questions asked, and if we don't get them, we'll try to at least get in a situation where we can try to answer them the best ways possible. Third speaker is Leslie Saracen, President and CEO of the FMI, the former Food Marketing Institute, the distributor, the people who get the food from the processor or from the farmer in some cases to the consumer. And so Leslie, you might talk about this from your perspective, the retailing side of the picture.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. And I'm happy to talk about the experience that we've had in the last couple of months. Clearly, these have been unprecedented times that have called for all of us in the industry to establish and really enact new precedents in the industry, and to almost do it overnight, which has not been an easy feat. But I'm proud to say that I think by and large across the board, we've been able to rise to the occasion. There are some specific areas that we have been focused on in the retail sector particularly. One is the references that you've heard already to the supply chain squeeze. You know, the number of customers coming into our stores have driven extraordinary demand at a time when supply was being tested in ways that we've never been tested before, due to some of the things we've heard about already: labor shortages, plant closures, and this unprecedented demand that we have experienced. It's just been almost overwhelming. And what we've seen is that our industry suppliers have responded with SKU alignments, with distribution pacing. We've also realigned the supply, as the secretary mentioned a few minutes ago. Products that would normally have been destined for the food service sector, we've worked very hard to figure out how to repurpose those and move them into the retail area. In fact, FMI created a partnership early on with the Food Service Distributors Association to redirect some of those food service products to the retail sector. And we've even grown that since that initial partnership to a broader partnership now that matches buyers with sellers across the entire supply chain. So clearly the squeeze on the supply chain has been important for us to address. We've also had unprecedented tests to our online capacity. We were experiencing what I would call sort of a gently sloping upward trend to online grocery shopping, and overnight it became more of a rock climb, I think, for us as an industry, as we had doubling and in some cases tripling of the demand for home delivery, store pickup, which most of us refer to as click and collect. And all of these changes have clearly challenged us, both taxing the technical and technology capacity of our member companies' stores' online ordering systems, as well as the physical pickup and delivery capabilities for the industry. The third area that we've focused on is unparalleled safety requirements. And what we've seen is that the grocery store, in many ways and in most communities, has become the social hub for the community, because nobody's really going anywhere else except to the grocery store. And so in those contexts, we've had to be very mindful of and serve as a model for safe distancing while people are in the stores. And, you know, I think this is yet another way that we have demonstrated clearly what's been referred to already as how essential food retail and food distribution is during any disaster situation. So our industry responded with the safety requirements like limitations at the store, both on the numbers of people, in some cases, who could enter the store at the same time, as well as in some cases, the numbers of products that people could buy in various categories. We've done specific in-store social distancing protocols that show how far 6 feet really is when you're standing in a checkout line, for example. We've doubled down on cleaning and sanitizing protocols. We've created special hours for our special needs customers. We've established new precedents in customer service and employee safety through the use of sneeze guards, masks, wipes, and the list goes on and on of the things that have happened. The next area that I think has been very important has been testing the mettle of our workforce. We've talked about the importance of the workforce here, and frankly, people who go to work in food retail and in other parts of the food distribution chain, I think don't have in their job descriptions that they're to be a public hero. But I would say that all of the folks throughout the distribution chain have been exactly that. They've been heroic in how they've shown up for work, many times I'm sure when they would have preferred not to. But this demand for labor is something that our stores have clearly recognized, and we've worked closely with them to try to help them work on hiring the literally hundreds of thousands of new employees that have gone into the food distribution sector since this whole thing started. We created an online talent exchange to help allow our customers, our companies who have employees who are not being deployed currently, to know about openings that are happening in the food distribution system, and create that match so that those individuals can find positions and our companies can be staffed appropriately. We have currently 390,000 impacted workers have joined the talent exchange via the companies they previously worked for, so that they could be available to be hired by other companies in the industry. And then finally, critical work that we've all done with the Secretary, with other government agencies, both at the federal level and the state and local level. And I have to give a shout out to all of those government agencies who have worked so hard and so closely with us on making sure that we gained access to the safety wear we needed, making the necessary regulatory and other adjustments that Secretary Perdue referenced a few moments ago. These have always all been invaluable to us in allowing us to do what we need to do to meet our customers' needs. And I know we'll hear more about this from Katie in a few minutes, but certainly the work that has been done in the SNAP arena has been tremendously helpful in making sure that we can meet those who need help the most, and maybe for the first time have had to ask for help. We're doing everything we can to make that as painless and as easy a process as possible. So I would say in closing that these unprecedented times have put the supply chain to the test, and we've had some hits and we've suffered some cuts and bruises along the way. But I think we've proven that our system is incredibly resilient and stronger than ever. And we look forward to continuing to demonstrate the importance of this industry and what we are capable of as an industry. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Before I get to Katie, I just want to mention, I'm very delighted that you talked about the essential nature of the workers all the way through, from the farmers to all those folks in the meat and poultry industry who work day to day, getting the product out, to your grocery workers, people that sometimes we ignored or didn't think how important they were to our lives. And in fact, this has caused a new maybe appreciation for those who work hard every single day to deliver the food, produce it, process it. And so I appreciate your mentioning that as well.
My pleasure.
And so Katie, you is EVP and COO of the great group Feeding America. The president, Claire, was unable to be here today, but we're delighted you're here. I just would mention one thing, in addition to maybe giving some statistics about what's going on, how you're dealing with the millions of Americans who never needed or tried to get food supplies because they were working, and overnight they're not working. Many of them are eligible for SNAP, but just haven't taken advantage of it just yet because of the speed and the rapidity of this crisis that we're having. And how you are at the front lines feeding millions of people is just amazing. We appreciate the efforts of you and your team, but thought you may want to talk for a few minutes, and I'm going to recognize my colleague Ann Veneman to begin the questions. So Katie.
Great. Thank you so much, Secretary Glickman and Secretary Veneman, and of course, Secretary Perdue. We are absolutely honored to be able to be a part of this panel and this discussion. I'll start by building off of what Leslie said and responding, Secretary Glickman, to your question, which is really an appropriate place to start, which is extending our appreciation and recognition for the tremendous heroes that are showing up every day in the 200 food banks that are a part of Feeding America, in the 60,000 agencies that are a part of our network. Many folks don't realize that during the course of an average year, that charitable food system, the Feeding America network of food banks and agencies, depends on 2 million volunteers also. And every day, Americans are coming out, even in the midst of this pandemic, to show up and to make sure that their neighbors and former coworkers and others have the food they need, the vital food that they need to nourish their families. So it is humbling. It is difficult. I'm here in the great state of Oklahoma, where I was the CEO of the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma. So worked with many of the state counterparts of the organizations that are represented on this call. And if you have not had to serve food to someone who has never had to ask for that help, people come to that experience with a great deal of shame and embarrassment. And what we have tried to communicate to people all across this great land is that this is why our system exists and why we enjoy this tremendous public-private partnership with the food industry and with government, to make sure that in people's time of need, when they're afraid of not being able to feed their children, that they know they can rely on America's charitable food system. In terms of demand, we have seen, as you can imagine, an incredible surge in demand. We have been pulse surveying our member food banks every 2 weeks since this began, and we have consistently gotten data that shows us that on average, food banks are experiencing a 70% increase in the number of people who are seeking food assistance across communities throughout this country. And we serve every community in every county in the country. Of those people, to your point, Secretary Glickman, 40% are consistently folks who have never had to ask for help with food. So they're trying to navigate, as you astutely pointed out, a very complex system, scared, can't predict their future. And we're trying to meet those folks where they are, reassure them, and make sure they know that food is going to be there for them. And we could not do that without the tremendous support from private industry, as represented on this panel, and certainly the role of the federal government. Our best estimate right now, we did a 6-month impact analysis. We're working on a 12-month analysis, but our 6-month analysis tells us that we can estimate that we will see 17 million more Americans experiencing food insecurity as a result of the pandemic. That's a 46% increase above the 37 million Americans who were estimated to be food insecure prior to COVID-19. And of that 54 million, then 18 million are children. So we have a tremendous challenge on our hands, and we're going to continue to need the vital support of the federal government as we move forward. We've been delighted and pleased, as has been referenced by others on the call, with the provisions that have been put into place through the first 2 acts that have gone through Congress, increases in TFAP, the establishment of the CFAP program, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, Farmers to Families box program, as well as the waivers and other flexibilities that have been provided in increases in SNAP. But what we do know and believe to be true is that this increase in demand is going to continue for some time. We are modeling with some of the brightest folks in the country, trying to get a grip on what that might look like as we look out 12 months. And we do expect fully to see this increased level of demand. And we're going to need to continue to see increases in SNAP. We very much support a 15% increase in benefits in SNAP. Would like to see the minimum benefit allowed to be at $30 rather than $16 for individual SNAP enrollees. It is one of the best ways that we can solve this problem for American families. As Leslie said, the food is in the stores, people's ability to go in, purchase the food that they need, to keep that supply chain flowing smoothly. We don't want to see American families spiral into financial ruin because of what has happened. And to keep our food industry, our farmers, and our families able to access that food, SNAP is just a tremendous boost economically and for those families. And then, of course, we would like to continue to see the level of support that's been given in TFAP and in other areas to make sure that our farmers can move product from fields and ranches into families' homes. Our food banks are doing their level best to be ready to receive that food in those boxes that are coming through CFAP. We at Feeding America and our member food banks have been working very hard to connect up with distributors, and we will not rest until we make sure that we are meeting the needs of the American people.
Okay, thank you. So I'll appreciate all 4 of you for excellent remarks. And now I'll turn to my colleague, Ann Veneman, to start the questions.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists. These were excellent presentations. And I think really established kind of where we are and the multiple issues we're dealing with during this pandemic and during this crisis time. It's likely that this situation, this crisis, is going to last for some time. And so many of you, or all of you, really have talked about the change that's happening. Where do you see that the food system will go from here? The trends you've talked about, what kinds of things will continue to accelerate in terms of practices? Are there policies and regulations that may need to be changed? And so if we could just hear from each of you, just sort of on the future side of this, and maybe we'll go in the same order of the way you spoke on the initial panel. Thank you. So Zippy, I'll let you begin.
Thank you, Secretary Vanderman. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to that. Of course, no one of us really knows what the future holds and how this will have a permanent effect on the food chain. I do know that there's going to have to be a lot of thought especially in the pipeline that feeds our protein and into the processing plants, and how the processing plants may adapt to that pipeline. You know, if you think about a farmer and he's geared up to raise, say, 1.5 million birds a year like I do on my farm, and all my financials are built on producing those 1.5 million birds, and then all of a sudden I have to cut back 30%, or I have to cut back 40%, or the company that's providing the birds for me start cutting back, then we started falling into some very financial difficulties. So there's going to have to be some leniency in financing. There's going to have to be some adjustments in there. And I really and truly think there's going to have to be some increase in cost of production of food so that farmers can handle what might cause us to have some cutbacks on our farm, just because the food chain is going to take time for them to build up to the point that they can handle the volume that we can produce. This is not a food issue. This is not a supply issue. It's a supply chain. And I hate to call it an issue. It's an adjustment, because those people out there are doing the best they can do under an unbelievable swing in buying patterns of the consumer. And I mean, we got heroes from one end of this chain to the other. And it's just been amazing that we've been nimble enough to be able to handle it and not have worse problems than we have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Veneman. Well, Zippy said it so well, and I think that for us to look at the ways in which USDA was able to assist on a short-term basis, for example, with labeling, not a food safety regulation, but just a labeling regulation to allow things that couldn't go into food service, were labeled for food service, to be redirected to retail. Those kinds of things, as we continue this slow process, and we all believe, I think, that it will be a very slow process to get back to food service and retail in more of the, as Secretary Perdue said earlier, that kind of 50-50 situation. We're going to need to do a lot of thinking together with our government as to how we become flexible in allowing that to happen in sort of a more smoothed out basis. We were so grateful to be able to have those conversations as we, had a lot of stuff that backed up, a lot of product that backed up right away as food service went down. I think a lot of the members ended up donating a lot of product to Feeding America, as a matter of fact, all across the country. And those are great short-term things. I think you asked about longer-term solutions, and we're beginning to think about those and want to have a role in how we become more flexible and more aligned. Maybe that's the word of the day, more aligned, so that when we have the next, hopefully not a pandemic, but when we have the next significant challenge to our food supply chain, that we have learned from this experience, whether it's in some kind of regulatory flexibility, but also proactive steps that industries are able to take to be as prepared as possible. We would welcome those kinds of further conversations with the this whole supply chain lined up here.
Thank you very much for this question. This is something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. As you might imagine, shopping patterns have changed dramatically in the past couple of months. And you may also be aware that we've been tracking at FMI, we've been tracking shopping trends for more than 40 years. So this is something that we take very seriously and watch carefully. We typically do it once a year, but since we started in this pandemic situation, we've actually been tracking just about weekly to see what changes we're seeing among shopping behaviors. And what I can share with you is that we are now making lists in ways we haven't before. We're thinking clearly on what it is we want to buy instead of just going to the store to see what looks good. We're actually doing planning for the first time in a while, I would say. And we're also talking to others in the household. It's no longer a situation where the primary shopper just goes and buys. We're now talking to each other because we're home together. And so we're talking to each other about what it is we'd like to have. Also, we're adjusting where we shop. Prior to the pandemic, we had reached a point where most shoppers were on average shopping about 4.4 different retail banners in a month's time. That's now down to about 1 or 2 different banners. We're not going as far away from home, and we're trying to buy as much as we can in as few visits as we can. We also have noted changes in eating habits since this started. In our recent study of more than about 1,000 American adults, we found that 76% of the participants said they've changed their eating habits during COVID-19, and 36% of those said they were eating healthier than they had been before. I think what will be interesting is to see whether the sales data actually proves that when it's all said and done, but that's what we're being reported from consumers. And also, I think an improvement we've seen is that concerns regarding access to food have lessened over time since the pandemic started. They've gone from about 36% of being concerned about having access to food at the end of March to just about 25% now. So that's an improvement that we think is critically important. The other thing I would just mention quickly is family meals. As you may remember, one of the things that we've promoted for a number of years now is National Family Meals Month, which is held in September. It's become, frankly, more of a movement now than just a month, and people are engaging in it, certainly in these last couple of months, much more frequently. I think it will be interesting to see how this focus on family meals and eating at home together, how that influences social behaviors, which of course is part of why we have promoted family meals, because of the positive social effects of eating as a family. So we're quite intrigued to see how that is going to affect our behaviors going forward. And then finally, in my opening comments, I talked about online shopping. The meteoric rise in online shopping that we've seen in the last 60 days is something that would have been hard to predict. In fact, in January of this year, we predicted that some of the numbers that we've seen in the last maybe 3 months were numbers that we might achieve over the next 5 years. So this has all happened really quickly. And I think the question remains how much people want to rely on someone else to do their picking in the stores for them, whether that convenience factor that they have enjoyed through this process, and frankly, the safety and security factors that go along with it during a pandemic is something that they want to continue to do as we come out of this situation. So we're quite intrigued to see how shopping patterns will change, and we'll be tracking those, and I look forward to chances to report on the changes in the future.
Right, thank you.
And I'll just go quickly to build on what others have said. For us, I would say the 2 things that stand out for us when we think about the future of how we hope that we can respond even more effectively in the future is making sure that we're really trying to bridge that gap between farm to food bank. It was so painful, as you all are well aware, and Zippy mentioned it, to watch farmers have to turn over their crops or dispose of milk or dispose of animals when there were thousands of people in line asking for charitable food assistance. So we would love to continue to work on policy solutions that will help us accelerate the bridging of that gap when this country needs to do it in a very agile way. We have some capacity opportunities to build greater capacity in the food bank charitable food system, and that's going to be one helpful way to make sure that that system can quickly connect to farmers across this country as needed. And then the last piece I would just reiterate is the critical role that SNAP can play in making sure that our country is able to very quickly respond to these surges in demand depending on what may be going on. It's a program that works so well and is designed really well to complement the ongoing flow of our food supply chain, and we want to very much continue to see those investments there.
So thanks. So if I may add just a question, because there have been several questions along this, and I would address this to Juliana, but anybody else could answer. You know, so many parts of the American economy have become so much more concentrated, whether it's airlines or banking and food and agriculture. And so there's been a lot of discussion about the nature of meat and poultry processing, where we have far fewer plants producing more food. And then when something happens, then you have more people affected just because you have fewer plants. I wonder if you could just talk about that and talk about what you see in the future as you deal with that issue, particularly as you deal with the issue of health and safety of people who work in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the concentration or the consolidation into a number of, small number of companies, and I'll just focus on the beef area for a bit, has been relatively constant for about the last 30 years. So it's not been something that has increased in concentration, if you will, in recent times. They're very expensive things to do to run efficiently. And so what the benefit to it is that for the last 20 years or so, families have spent only about 10% of their disposable income on food. So part of the efficiency of the system that we have been discussing here this afternoon does come from the size of these of the plants, and the difficulty then happens when you have one that goes down that has quite a significant impact on the overall capacity for getting animals through the system and getting food into consumers. When there is one event, such as last summer, there was a fire at a Kansas facility. What we had here with the pandemic was nationwide, and because of the nature of this crisis, the nature of the virus spreading throughout the workforce, you had significant downturn in capacity. At this point, I believe even with the plants that have come back online, we're still running reduced by about 24% capacity on the pork side and about 31% on the beef side. Now that is trending in the right direction in terms of getting back up to speed, but it does mean that the attention to health and safety of the workforce is paramount. It has been, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very labor-intensive physical activity to process meat and poultry. But it can't be done without our heroic team members who show up every day in these challenging times to do that. So What we have seen is, in addition to a lot of the proactive things that we have done in the plants to address the health and safety of the workers, face shields, face masks, dividers in hallways, dividers in places where they're putting on and off their protective equipment, and in cafeterias and in places where they come into the plant. Those are the kinds of things that need to be communicated over and over again, not just to the workforce in very effective ways, but also in the communities where these plants are operating, so that the support for those workers and for the economic activity that is going on in these communities is kind of part of the equation when we think about what why they are operating and how they are operating. I think that for the companies themselves that own numerous plants, they're all different sizes. They're not all massive plants. They might own several plants, a fair number of plants, but they're not all the same size. So I guess that's the trade-off with the kind of consolidation that happened 3 decades ago. You do have a price that you pay for food, for meat and poultry anyway, in the grocery store, that continues to be acceptable to our consumers.
Great, thank you. Anne?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up a little bit, because I think the issue of meat has been really forefront in the news lately, but kind of put a different spin on it, and maybe ask both Zippy and Juliana to comment on this a bit. And I don't know whether Leslie would want to comment with regard to the grocery stores, but Reuters ran a story yesterday, and the headline was, as US meat workers fall sick and supplies dwindle, exports to China soar. Now, Zippy, you talked earlier about the importance of trade. And Juliana, you just talked about the issue of the reduced capacity in the plants. How do we create this access for consumers and yet maintain our export markets, which, as you indicated, are so important?
I'm a Southern gentleman, so lady, Juliana, please go first.
Well, so it's the impact to our farmers has been tremendous for and to all of us in the meat industry, for keeping the best quality beef, pork, poultry, raised by our hardworking American farmers here, in our export markets. It has been a tremendous success story. We feed the world, and we do it in a way that is efficient, environmentally sound, and keeps our American agricultural economy in a tremendous spot most of the time when those markets are available to us. When we if we go to not exporting in some way, some sort of export controls at this point, that will have the impact of raising prices here at home. The ability for you've heard the phrase everything but the oink. Every part of the animals that are harvested, that are raised and harvested, are used somewhere in the system. And so there are a lot of parts of the animals that maybe aren't here for aren't popular here for our consumption, but are very popular in other parts of the world. And so that kind of ingenuity and that kind of ability to maintain those markets keeps our agricultural economy strong, feeds people around the world, and has the impact of making us all a little closer together, I think. And so we would not want to give up those markets if we don't have to. I think the real challenge is getting these plants back up to capacity so that we can deal with the backlog that we have. I think Leslie said it very well. You know, we've been dealing with really increased demand, and incredible, as we have seen. The same numbers that Leslie has seen and was talking about this past week, I think with the meat in the news, you know, we're seeing demand numbers at the grocery store that were like they were at the beginning of the pandemic. I think that the ability to continue to produce just depends on getting these plants back to a situation where we're moving things into the system that's already there as efficiently as possible. So I'm going to end with saying I'm like Leslie, very optimistic about the resilience of the food supply chain. And so I would say there is no need for concern that what is being exported is going to impact our supplies here at home.
Of course, Mr. Secretary, we farmers always think Americans first. Of course, that's where our priority is. Americans first, safety of employees, regardless of what link in the chain, food chain it is always first. But when you talk about trade, when everything's running smooth and everything in agriculture is a pipeline and a chain, we need to be able to sell those products across the country. Now, the item that Juliana spoke of is right. The world has different cultures in it. They like different parts of the animal. My chickens, Americans really don't like thigh meat, and they don't really like the paws. And all of those, most of it goes across seas somewhere else. And as a chicken farmer, I want that to happen. The other thing is we have to make sure that we continue to trade with these countries, because you as secretaries know how difficult it is to create a market. And once you lose that market, they go somewhere else and buy their product, and how to talk them into coming back and doing business with us is very difficult. So it is a very sensitive area that we have to talk about, but we have to keep those trade lines open for future of agriculture. The other thing too I'd like to speak to is we talk about small families farms, and over 95% of the farms across America are owned by families, and that's wonderful. But what's the definition of a family farm today? It's not the same as it was in the 30s and 40s and the 60s. You know, today to make a living for a family where there's a dad and a son, or maybe an uncle or a cousin, I mean, you got to farm 3,000 or 4,000 acres of land, or you got to grow 1.5 million birds on your place, or you got to have 500 cow-calf pairs out there. So, you know, there's a lot of difference in that. And to do that, we got to have somewhere to move that commodity to have a market for it. And we're in a global market, whether we like it or not. And to do that, we got to be, I heard Secretary Perdue say it, what sets us apart from the world is our reliability, our ability to produce quality and deliver it on time, our infrastructure. And that's what sets us apart from the world. And if we ever break that confidence with the rest of the world, we may never regain some of those markets back.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question, probably more for Katie than anybody else, but there are a lot of audience questions about SNAP and about this new food box that the USDA is going to get to consumers, whether it's through the Feeding America program or elsewhere. And the question is that SNAP used to have a much greater bipartisan support for it, and it's become more partisan in recent years. And I'm just curious how you see the relationship between SNAP and all these millions of people coming in and signing up and getting participating in the food bank system. I mean, are you encouraging folks to go into the SNAP program if they qualify, or if the regs permit their qualifications, or if waivers are needed? Because you know, there are a lot of people may see all of these food bank lines and figure out, well, we don't need a SNAP program. All you need is, it's kind of like during the Depression, you'd see those lines, brother, can you spare a dime? And people would stand in line and get food. And the food stamp or the SNAP program has been a remarkable way of allowing poor people, mostly with families, many of them temporary, to get access to quality, nutritious food. Too long of a question, but I wonder if you might answer that.
Well, I'll just build on what you laid out there, Secretary Glickman. I mean, we know that in a pre-COVID environment, for every meal that the charitable food assistance network in this country provides through Feeding America, again, that's 200 food banks serving every county in the United States, SNAP can provide 9 meals. It is at a scale as a solution that is beyond what the charitable sector can provide. And when you're in an environment that we're in, all of us together right now, with this unprecedented level and surge in demand, it is the right solution to be deployed along with making sure that we are doing everything we can to optimize the charitable food system as well. So we do at food banks all across this country make sure that as people are, again, 40% of whom right now have never had to access charitable food in their life, as they're coming to food banks, that they're not only leaving with food, and we can't wait to have the farmers to food our families boxes coming online here soon, so that they're leaving with those boxes, but that they're also learning about what programs, and SNAP being the dominant program, that they could qualify for to make sure that they feed their families. Again, from our point of view, it's a nonpartisan solution. We hope people can continue or can look at it that way, because it really does so much for our retail partners. It does so much for, again, making sure food is moving through the supply chain, and it boosts local economies. For every dollar invested in SNAP, it's producing $1.70 in economic gain in local communities, and that's what our communities need right now. So I can't speak to, obviously, there are folks who have a whole variety of different feelings about the SNAP program, but we believe that the evidence is overwhelming that it is a terrific solution for the American family, farmers, and the food industry.
If I could also add to that, let me just say that on behalf of the nation's retailers, we are proud partners with USDA in executing the SNAP program through our stores. And for our organizations, we are almost always, I think annually, some of the largest contributors to the nation's food banks as well. So we're involved in both aspects of this, and think it's a critical role for our industry to play, certainly up from the retail and wholesale sector, and will continue to do so. We've worked closely with Feeding America for many years, and look forward to continuing to do that, as well as with USDA on the SNAP program.
Thank you.
If I might now just follow up a bit on looking at food aid and the need out there, which I think you've so ably kind of put on the table. I think there has been a lot of creativity during this time of crisis with all of the children who are out of school and the replacements that are being used for school lunches. So some people are picking up lunches at the schools, they're picking up food. Some people are, there's school buses that are being used to deliver the food to the children. And there's also this new EBT program for the replacement of school lunches. The question I have is, has there been any discussion about how the summer feeding programs would work? Could it be a continuation of the school lunch, current EBT programs, and and the other kinds of programs that are going on? Or is there a possibility that we will not have that kind of continued opportunity for getting food to these children during the summer months?
So Secretary Veneman, I'm happy to start there. We very much would like to see the non-congregate rule, which has been waived for federal nutrition programs for children, continue through the summer and frankly, for as long as schools would be out of session. I can speak from personal experience as a former food bank CEO that served 53 counties in central and western Oklahoma, that our ability to feed children in the summer months dropped off precipitously because of congregate feeding rules in rural America. It's very difficult to get meals to children who live, out in rural America and farm communities and can't get to a congregate feeding site. One of the things that we hope people will see from this pandemic is the tremendous leadership that the USDA has done to waive that and make sure children could access those meals and take them home has been just a godsend for families all over this nation. And we would love to see continued creativity and new thinking about how we can best meet children's needs through that kind of program. And then the pandemic EBT solution is really critical to make sure, again, ease of consumers to be able to get that food, the equivalent of those meals in the grocery store from our retailers. And Leslie, who's so well articulated the commitment of American retailers to participate in SNAP. So both of those are really critical solutions.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, Bill Hoagland, do you have any live questions you'd like to ask? Bill is the leader of the BPC effort in this, and I just didn't know if you...
Go right ahead, Mr. Secretary. You got a number of questions that have come in from outside. I think those should be answered. Should try answering them.
A lot of the questions relate to the public support for our feeding programs, food SNAP program and summer feeding programs. And I wonder if, you're all involved in this in one way or the other, from producing the food to distributing the food. How do you gauge the public support during this time period? Anybody can answer.
I'll jump in real quick to say we have been overwhelmed with the embrace that Americans have had around recognizing the food insecurity of their neighbors and wanting to pitch in and help. And whether that's making a charitable contribution to their local food bank or to Feeding America, which has been tremendous, to the inordinate number of offers we've gotten from private industry to come in and stand beside us and food banks and offer coolers and freezers and trucks. And I mean, just the outpouring of generosity is so emblematic of who we are as Americans. And again, our experience has always been that food security is most effectively addressed when it is a public-private partnership. And what, the tremendous role of the federal government and the state governments. The states have been very involved in participating in the rules and waivers, deploying National Guard to food banks to help provide food. So it is a testament to who we are as people that we don't want to see any one of us hungry and afraid of how we're going to feed our children. It's just tremendous.
I would totally agree. Oh, I'm sorry, Zippy, go ahead.
No, Leslie, go ahead.
I would totally agree with Katie's comments. We've seen this public-private partnership thing, I think, has been critical in recent months. We've seen companies do amazing things. I have one company that has gone directly to farmers and bought product and then turned around and donated it to the local food banks. And so I just think this compassion and outpouring of support for our neighbors is something that is unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, and something that I think is so critical to trying to achieve our goals here, which is to make sure that all of our citizens are able to be fed.
And can I just intervene? Is the lack of refrigeration a problem that we could address in some way through either federal, state, local, or private sector help? I get the impression that the transportation and refrigeration is a problem, particularly as you watch farmers unable to, let's say, get rid of some of their product in the processing facilities or milk or whatever. And then there's no way to get it from point A to point B except on a very ad hoc basis. That was a question that was asked by the audience.
You know, from my perspective, I think that is a challenge. I would say it may be less of a challenge today than it was 60 days ago or 45 days ago, when we were so concerned about meeting this overwhelming demand of the items being sold at retail. There's a little less pressure now with that. And so I think we are not feeling as much of the stress that we had felt on where we were going to find enough truck drivers, where we were going to get enough vehicles to transport products, et cetera. And I think the ability to redeploy things from the food service sector into non-food service jobs and activities has made a huge difference on that front as well.
Secretary Glickman, they asked about what kind of public support's out there. We started hearing a lot of people concerned about whether or not farmers were still going to farm this year and how they were going to survive. So we started the hashtag Still Farming. We touched 50 million people with that hashtag. People have responded all over the country and the world to that hashtag. And I thought, I'm not a big social media person, but I thought that was pretty impressive. The social media people in my life said that's really, really an unbelievable accomplishment. The other thing is, since we wrote the letter with Feeding America to USDA and the word got out, we're constantly having companies call us and say, hey, we got refrigeration, we got trucks. You know, we just every week we have another company or another farmer or someone calling saying, how can we be part of this? How can we help? And we pass those on to the people that can take that in and make it work. So we've just been overwhelmed. You know, like 9/11, this is kind of a 9/11 moment for us, and it brings the best out of Americans. And I'm just real proud of our country from the top to the bottom.
Well, and I'll just build on what I think Julie said earlier in Zippy, is that we at Feeding America, along with everyone who's involved with the supply chain, I think wants to make sure that on the other side of this, and there'll be another side of this someday, that we have a supply chain which has been resilient and strong, but comes out even stronger, and a charitable food system, frankly, that also comes out stronger. I think people have seen and been unfortunately reminded of the incredible value that the charitable food system plays, both in the supply chain as well as in making sure that on a dime it can pivot to meet the needs of hungry Americans. And we're very, very much wanting to make sure that that system continues to be as robust as it is, but more so in the future.
If I could ask one question that was up from the audience, and it was about how do we continue to discuss an issue that's near and dear to both Dan Glickman and my hearts, and that is nutrition security, not just food security. And Leslie, I think you raised in your remarks the fact that people seem to be eating healthier, but it is something that we probably want to start watching. And I think it's particularly important now when we know that this COVID disease is impacting people who have diet-related diseases like obesity and diabetes. It has a more severe impact, it's showing, on these people. And so I think we cannot lose sight in the discussion of food that nutrition really has to underscore everything in the long run. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on this, but I think it is a very important question.
I will comment, and thank you for raising it, Secretary Veneman. I think it's an incredibly important part of the equation. You know, I referenced nutrition in a couple of contexts in my opening comments. One is what consumers are reporting to us that they're doing as they are at home. And, you know, the data will tell us shortly, probably, whether in fact what they report they're doing is what they're actually doing in eating healthier at home. But I would also say that one of the reasons we have been so supportive of family meals and this notion of a family meals movement is because we know that family meals cooked at home are more nutritious. I mean, the data show that they just are more nutritious, and families eating at home have lots of other social benefits as well. So I'm hopeful that in addition to what our consumers that we're surveying tell us they're doing, this notion of the fact that we're all eating together, probably at unprecedented levels, at least in my lifetime, will have the desired effect of having us all focus on a more nutritious diet than we might normally have if we were just running around like chickens with our heads cut off like we normally do. But hopefully this will be a good way for us to begin to focus more on nutrition and the way we're feeding our families.
And the dietary guidelines for Americans process is just winding up, and we will be getting that report out. I believe, pandemic or no pandemic, I believe the work has been done. And for the first time, I believe the panel, the committee looked at nutrition for birth to 24 months and pregnant women. And so we're really in a good place, I think, to begin, as Leslie said, thinking more holistically about how we feed ourselves going forward with all of these people, including the 3 teenagers in my house who have been doing more cooking since we've been home. And I think about all those people who have gotten on online and ordered cookware because for the first time, they were trying to figure out what to do with what they picked up at the grocery store. So I think there are some very positive things that we can focus on in public policy as we continue this conversation going forward.
Well,
Could I say
sure,
that
absolutely.
I think there's a link from the past that is being broken that really concerns me. And our extension service back to our counties, into the school systems, our ag education as to how our food is grown, where it's grown, why we do certain production things. I think that lack of reaching back to our children and teaching them early is becoming very obvious to us today. And I know there's a lot of places children can learn, but it's nothing like having some professional stand in front of them and talk to them about food nutrition as a child in a classroom setting, or a professional talking to them about agriculture and why we do certain things on the farm. And we know that with budgets and local governments and school boards, that chain is being strained and becoming less and less a part of our children's education and life. And I really, you hate to look back and reach back, but just think of all the wonderful benefits that we all had growing up with that kind of education. And I think we're missing a lot of that now.
Well said, Zippy. So I'm going to turn it over to Ann to close, but I would just say this was not intended to explore every aspect of this, quote, supply chain issue. And I hope that the BPC and others can get your involvement to continue to develop these issues. But it's not just food, it's nutrition, it's health, it's poverty, it's jobs, it's trade. I mean, probably the food system is the most important part of our national and global economy. And when something happens to it, it should cause us to really drill down and evaluate it from top to bottom. So I want to thank you all and turn it over to Ann to close the event.
Well, I want to say thank you also. What a terrific panel. I mean, I think we just couldn't have had a better group, and we really, really appreciate your time. And we certainly appreciate everybody who has asked the questions. There's way too many to answer, but hopefully these questions that you've submitted will inform our thinking as we go forward and talk about these issues in greater detail. I just wanted to make a few observations before we closed. I think one thing is very clear, and that this pandemic has really impacted every part of the food chain. And that's clear from the discussion today. As the secretary said in his opening remarks, prior to this pandemic, 50% of the food in this country was going through what we call out-of-home outlets, whether it's restaurants or it's food service, school lunches, venues of all kinds. And when we lost that out-of-home market, supply chains have been challenged. There's no question. We've seen food go to waste. Very painful to see that in the newspapers and on the television. And at the same time, we've seen people more than ever who are waiting in line for hours at food banks because they've lost jobs and livelihoods. And I think one of the things we've heard, I think Juliana mentioned the need for flexibility and alignment. And that's, I think all of you have really brought out how the food distribution system, the food system as a whole has been realigning, and really quite quickly. It's really only been about 60 days. I think we've also heard that innovation is going to accelerate. Of course, technology linking farmers to alternative consumers, as we talked about, food purchasing trends. I like the statement that we are today where some of the grocery outlets thought we would be in 5 years in terms of everything from online ordering, grocery pickup, delivery of grocery, meal kits, restaurant food delivery like Postmates and Uber Eats. All of these are likely to change consumer behavior over the long term, and particularly the short term, as this pandemic doesn't seem to have a short life. Obviously, there's been interruptions in the meat supply, and this may accelerate trends toward more plant-based diets and alternatives. We don't know. There may be there is certainly a need for innovation throughout the food chain to make it more responsive to changes in demand and to protect workers. And there's likely to be changes that will be needed likewise in the harvesting to protect the workers there and make sure we can get the food out of the fields. I think this really points to one important point that we've heard today, and that is the entire food chain must find ways to protect the workers from the disease so that we can continue to have a viable food chain. So whether it's the farm workers, the warehouse workers, the truck drivers, the grocery clerks, or those delivering the food to the homes, all of these people really need to not only be saluted, but we need to protect them from this disease and do everything that we can. We didn't talk today about the impact of this global crisis on the global food system, but this health crisis around the globe could become also a global food crisis, causing hunger and unrest around the world. And that clearly would affect our national security. And that's something I think we all need to keep in mind going forward. So I would just like to again say thank you to the panel. Thank you to the 600 people who joined us today. Remarkably, we hope that this is only the beginning of the conversation about how we address all of these challenges that are ahead. Thank you again so much.
Thank you all. Appreciate your being on, and especially our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.